A 911 operator asks a simple question. Is she moving at all? There's a long pause. Then, a shaky voice answers. I just went inside, and I don't think she's breathing. That call would open the door, literally and figuratively, to one of the strangest murder investigations San Jose police had ever worked. Because when officers arrived, they thought they already knew what happened. A woman, alone in her kitchen, a knife in her hand. Case closed, right? Wrong. What they didn't know yet was that the real killer had already left the house hours earlier, and that the only witness who could prove it wasn't a person at all. It was a $100 fitness tracker on the victim's wrist. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a simple step counter and heart rate monitor cracked open a case that everyone, including the killer himself, thought would never be solved. Stick around, because the person who did this is the last person anyone would have suspected, and I mean literally, the last person. Let's go back to the beginning. Thursday, September 14th, around 5 p.m., San Jose, California. A woman named Amber dials 911. She's frantic, out of breath, standing outside a house on a quiet residential street. Amber isn't family. She's a co-worker. She'd worked alongside a woman named Karen Navarra for nearly 3 decades at a local hospital pharmacy. When Karen didn't show up for her shift 2 days in a row and didn't answer any calls, their employer asked Amber to drive over and check on her, since she lived close by. Here's a question for you before we go further. If you hadn't heard from a co-worker in 2 days, and they never missed work without calling first, would that scare you enough to go check their house yourself? That's exactly what Amber did. She knocked. No answer. She banged harder. Still nothing. Finally, she tried the door, and it was unlocked. She pushed it open just enough to see inside. What she saw made her stomach drop. Karen was seated in a chair near the kitchen counter, completely still, her face marked with dark discoloration. Amber didn't go any closer. She backed out immediately and called for help, telling the dispatcher she wasn't sure if her friend was even alive. Within minutes, San Jose police arrived. And this is where the story takes its first strange turn, because at first, officers weren't sure they were looking at a crime scene at all. When police entered the home, they found 67-year-old Karen Navarra seated in a wooden chair, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She had severe injuries to her skull and face, and in her right hand, a large kitchen knife, roughly 13 inches long. For a brief moment, based on the position of her body and the knife in her hand, responding officers considered the possibility that this was self-inflicted. But something didn't add up. The injuries were too severe, too numerous, for someone to have caused them to themselves. Blood was scattered not just on Karen's body, but across the kitchen, on the floor, the counter, even splattered on nearby surfaces. Several chairs had been knocked over, suggesting a struggle had taken place. And then there was the rest of the house. In the master bedroom and bathroom, drawers had been pulled open and their contents dumped on the floor, the kind of mess you'd expect from a burglary. Except nothing appeared to be missing. So ask yourself, if this was a robbery, why would a burglar spend time making a woman's death look like a suicide instead of just running? None of it made sense yet, but it would. Detectives quickly reclassified the case. This wasn't a suicide. This wasn't necessarily a simple burglary gone wrong either. This was a homicide. And somewhere out there, a killer who had gone to great lengths to disguise what they'd done was still walking free. To understand this case, you have to understand who Karen was. She'd worked as a pharmacy technician for nearly 30 years at a regional medical center. She never married, had no children, and lived a quiet, private life in a house that had originally belonged to her grandmother. passed down to her after her grandmother's death. Amber, her co-worker of 27 years, told police that despite knowing Karen for almost 3 decades, she actually knew very little about her personal life. Karen kept to herself. She loved her cats. She loved gardening. She showed up to work reliably and never caused trouble. No known enemies. No history of conflict with anyone. No red flags of any kind. Which raises an unsettling question, one that would hang over this entire investigation. If a woman with no enemies, no dangerous secrets, and no history of trouble is murdered in her own home, who would want to hurt her, and why? At this point, investigators lean toward one working theory. Maybe this really was a burglary that spiraled into violence. A stranger, breaking in, getting caught in the act, and panicking. But as Karen's family began arriving at the scene, that theory was about to be tested by someone nobody expected. Among the family members who showed up outside Karen's house that day was her stepfather, a 91-year-old man we'll refer to by his first name, Tony. He'd been married to Karen's mother for years, and by all accounts, had a warm relationship with his stepdaughter. When police spoke to him, Tony seemed talkative, almost cheerful, telling officers about how he'd brought Karen pizza and cookies just days earlier, and how she'd joked about wanting to have a pizza party with her friends. Here's something important. Tony told police he'd last seen Karen alive on Saturday, September 8th, 5 days before her body was found. He said he dropped off food around 3 p.m., stayed for a few minutes and left. He even claimed that about 2 hours later, he saw her drive past his house and wave at him. If that's true, Tony would just be a kind, elderly stepfather who has no idea what happened to his stepdaughter after he left. An old man who brought pizza and left. Nothing more. But investigators couldn't just take his word for it. Not yet. Because at that point, they still didn't know how or exactly when Karen died. And that gap, that missing piece of the timeline, was about to become the entire case. Meanwhile, back inside the house, the homicide unit had taken over, and they noticed something troubling. The pizza Tony brought was sitting half-eaten on the kitchen counter. But the cookies he mentioned, nowhere to be found. A small detail. But in a case like this, small details matter more than you'd think. The next morning, Karen's body was sent for autopsy, and what the medical examiner found erased any remaining doubt about what had happened. X-rays revealed multiple severe fractures to her skull. Once her hair was carefully shaved away for examination, deep wounds across her head and face became visible, wounds far too numerous and far too powerful for Karen to have inflicted on herself. Some of the blows were forceful enough to fracture bone and would have left her unable to move almost instantly. The medical examiner's conclusion was clear. This was a homicide. The weapon was likely something sharp and heavy, possibly a small axe or hatchet, not the kitchen knife found in her hand. Investigators now believed that knife had been deliberately placed there afterward to make the scene look like a suicide. Someone had beaten Karen Navarra to death, then staged the scene to throw investigators off. Now for the hard part, figuring out who. That same afternoon, detectives visited Karen's mother, Adele, and her husband, Tony, again. This time, it wasn't a casual conversation. It was to inform them, officially, that Karen had been murdered. And if you're thinking Tony must have reacted with shock or fear at that moment, you'd be right to wonder. Because his reaction, and the small inconsistencies in what he said next, would soon put him at the center of the investigation. Before we get into how detectives cracked this case wide open, using a piece of technology nobody expected, if you're new here, hit subscribe, because we cover cases just like this one every week. And if you've got a theory about who did this and why, drop it in the comments below. I want to see if you can figure it out before the reveal. Also, Hit that like button if this story has you hooked so far. Trust me, it only gets more unbelievable from here. All right, let's get back into it. Here's where the case starts to unravel. Detectives began digging into Tony's story, specifically his claim that he saw Karen driving past his house, waving at him, hours after he'd left her home. If that were true, it would mean Karen was alive and well long after Tony's visit, and the real killer struck sometime later. So over the next several days, investigators pulled footage from Ring doorbell cameras and other security cameras positioned around the neighborhood, along the route between Karen's house and Tony's. They were looking for one thing: proof that Karen's car passed by Tony's house that afternoon, just like he said. They never found it. Not a single camera along that route captured Karen's car at the time Tony described. But that wasn't even the most damning discovery. When detectives reviewed footage from cameras near Karen's own driveway, they found something that directly contradicted Tony's account of a quick 5-minute visit. At 2:58 p.m., Karen's driveway was empty. By 3:12 p.m., a small gray car, matching the one Tony drove, was parked outside. That car didn't move again until 3:35 p.m. Do the math with me for a second. That's not 5 minutes. That's over 20 minutes. More than 4 times longer than Tony claimed he'd stayed. So now detectives had 2 problems on their hands. First, the person Tony claimed to have seen driving Karen's car later that day appeared to not exist. No footage of it anywhere. Second, Tony himself had been at the house far longer than he admitted. At this point, would you still believe Tony was just an innocent old man who brought pizza and left? Or does something feel off? Detectives felt the same way. On September 25th, a judge signed off on an arrest warrant for Tony on suspicion of murder, along with a warrant to search his home. Officers moved in and took Tony into custody. He appeared confused, almost bewildered, as he was handcuffed and placed in a patrol car. At the station, while briefly left alone in an interrogation room, Tony began muttering quietly to himself, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that he was being recorded. Was he genuinely confused about why he'd been arrested, or was this the beginning of a performance designed to make himself look like a harmless, forgetful old man? That question would follow him through everything that came next. When detectives began questioning him formally, Tony came across as calm, even a little chatty. He talked about never having so much as a speeding ticket in his life. He talked about his family. He seemed, on the surface, like someone with nothing to hide. But when detectives brought the conversation back to that Saturday afternoon, the day he visited Karen, his story started to shift in small but critical ways. This is the part of the case that changes everything, so pay close attention. When Karen's body was examined, investigators noticed she was wearing a Fitbit, a small fitness tracker most people use to count steps or track their heart rate during a workout. Nobody buys one of these thinking it might someday become the single most important piece of evidence in their own murder investigation. But that's exactly what happened. Here's why that device mattered so much. A Fitbit doesn't just count steps. It logs movement continuously throughout the day, and many models also track heart rate in real time. If Karen was wearing hers when she died, it would have recorded the exact moment her body stopped moving, and the exact moment her heart stopped beating. In other words, it created a timestamp for her death, down to the minute. When detectives had the device analyzed, the data was unmistakable. Karen's movement stopped on September 8th, the same day Tony visited her, and her heart rate monitor showed something even more precise. Her heart stopped at 3:28 p.m. Now here's the question I want you to sit with for a second. Remember the footage. Tony's car arrived at 3:12 p.m. It didn't leave until 3:35 p.m. That means Karen's heart stopped beating while Tony's car was still sitting in her driveway. He wasn't a witness who left before something terrible happened. According to the data on Karen's own wrist, he was inside that house at the exact moment she died. When detectives laid this out for him directly, telling him his own timeline placed him there at her time of death, Tony's composed, friendly demeanor started to crack. He insisted he had no explanation. He said if he'd really been there that long, he simply didn't remember it. But I don't remember doesn't explain away a scientifically recorded time of death. Once the Fitbit data was on the table, detectives went further. They pointed out something about the crime scene itself. Pieces of the pizza Tony brought were found on the floor beneath Karen's body, meaning she had likely been sitting down eating it when she was attacked. That detail contradicted Tony's claim that Karen had simply walked him to the door and said goodbye while he was still there. Then came the DNA. Investigators had collected swabs from the backs of Karen's hands and from the knife found gripped in her fingers. The knife they believed had been staged to look like a suicide weapon. When asked directly whether his DNA could be found on Karen's hands or on that knife, Tony denied it completely. He claimed he'd never even touched a knife in that house. Meanwhile, at Tony's own home, officers were conducting a search, and what they found there would be even harder to explain away than any timeline. Karen's mother, Aiello, mentioned something to investigators almost in passing. A few days earlier, she'd helped Tony wash a shirt that had blood on it. His explanation at the time was that he'd cut himself slicing lemons in the kitchen. Now, ask yourself, how much blood does it actually take from a small kitchen cut before an entire shirt needs to go in the wash? When detectives searched the home, they found that same shirt, and it wasn't the only one. A second shirt, a plain white undershirt, also tested presumptive positive for blood. So did a pair of pants with reddish-brown stains around the knee area. Investigators even found blood traces in a sink inside a converted garage space, a sink Tony claimed he never used. And then there was a raincoat tucked away in the house, with bloodstains on it too. When confronted with all of this, the timeline, the pizza, the DNA swabs, the bloody clothing, Tony's story began to fall apart in real time. He started contradicting himself. At one point, seemingly talking half to himself and half to the detectives, he mentioned something about sitting in his car for a while after leaving the house because he was short of breath. But the surveillance footage never showed him doing that. It showed his car simply parked, motionless, for over 20 minutes, then driving away. Every new detail chipped away at his story, and detectives made sure he knew it. So here's the question that's probably been on your mind this whole time. Why? Why would a 90-year-old man with no criminal history, someone who, by his own account, had never even gotten a serious traffic ticket in his life, brutally kill his own stepdaughter? Detectives asked themselves the same thing, and the honest answer is, we don't fully know. Investigators did uncover some financial red flags. Records showed that a few years earlier, Tony had been denied an equity loan after requesting a larger amount than the bank was willing to approve, which raised questions about whether he was under more financial strain than he let on, despite insisting to police that he and his wife were financially stable. Detectives floated other theories too, including the uncomfortable possibility that Tony may have shown up that day looking for something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with money. But Tony denied every possible motive they raised. No money problems, no conflict, no explanation of any kind for why Karen was dead and why the evidence pointed so directly at him. Sometimes, in true crime cases, you get a clear, satisfying motive tied up with a bow, and sometimes, like here, you're left with a mountain of physical evidence and a suspect who simply refuses or is unable to explain himself, which, in a strange way, might be even more unsettling. By the end of the interrogation, detectives laid out everything for Tony, piece by piece. The surveillance footage placing his car at the scene for over 20 minutes. The Fitbit data pinpointing Karen's death to 3:28 p.m. while he was still there. The half-eaten pizza on the floor beneath her body. The bloody clothing found in his own home. The traces of blood in a sink he claimed he never used. Every single denial he offered ran straight into another piece of evidence that contradicted it. Tony never confessed. Not once. He maintained, right up until the end of that interrogation, that he had no explanation for any of it, that he didn't remember, that it wasn't him, that he could never do something like that to Karen. But detectives felt they had more than enough to move forward. Tony was formally arrested and charged with the murder of his stepdaughter, Karen Navarra. Here's where this case takes one final, frustrating turn. About a year after Karen's death, while Tony was still awaiting trial, his health began to seriously decline. According to his family, his condition worsened steadily over time. On September 10th, 2019, Tony died at a hospital in Santa Clara Valley, before the case ever made it to trial. And because he died before a verdict could be reached, all charges against him were legally dropped. Under the law, he was never formally convicted of Karen Navarra's murder. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because he never lived long enough to face a jury. Karen's family, and everyone who worked this case, were left with mountains of evidence, and no final verdict. No closure, in the form most people hope for after a case like this. It's one of the strange, uncomfortable truths about true crime. Sometimes the evidence is overwhelming, the story is airtight, and justice still doesn't get its final chapter. So, knowing everything you just heard, do you think Tony acted alone? Do you think there's more to this story that never came out? Let me know what you think down in the comments. If you enjoyed this case breakdown, make sure you're subscribed, because we post new true crime deep dives every week. And trust me, some of the upcoming ones are even harder to believe than this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.